Hi, I'm Dr. Joby. Welcome to the podcast. This week we'll be listening to a simulcasted lecture on the theories of personality regarding the humanistic approach to personality. We'll begin with Abraham Maslow and then move on to Carl Rogers. Humanist psychology really emerged in the United States in the 1960s and 1970s. And it was really a reaction against the prevailing paradigm in American academic psychology, which was behaviorism. And there were many psychologists and thinkers who felt that behaviorism was just too superficial and too surface level to fully encompass the richness of the human condition. And looking for an alternative to behaviorism, the other dominant way of thinking about psychology, at least in therapeutic psychology, was psychoanalysis. And for many psychologists and thinkers, this wasn't satisfactory either, placing so much emphasis on unconscious motivations and even, to some extent, at least with Freud, with biological drives. And so a third way was desired. And the third way that emerged, we refer to in the United States as humanism. Now, the interesting thing is the originating founders of this humanism were not strictly in the 1960s and 70s, and they certainly weren't American. There has been a long tradition of existential phenomenological psychology, which has its roots in European thought back to Nietzsche. Nietzsche's writings on secular existentialism. We can even go back and think of Kierkegaard and theistic existentialism or Christian existentialism. And both of these groups, these existentialists that go from Kierkegaard and Nietzsche in their own respective lineage through individuals like Husserl and Heidegger, Martin Heidegger, and to Jean-Paul Sartre and Albert Camus and Proust, and to individual figures in Europe such as Rollo May, and here in the United States, Carl Rogers and Abraham Maslow. Many of these existential phenomenological thinkers were interested in really the four issues of existentialism. Now, these four main issues of existentialism have been paraphrased by an American existential psychologist, Irvin Yalom, and these are the issues of mortality, so confronting the prospect of our eventual death, looking at issues of freedom and responsibility, looking at issues of isolation, and also looking at issues of purpose, meaningfulness in our lives and how we come about this. So really these four issues, understanding our immortality, exploring our free will, our freedom, and our responsibility within that framework, the experience of isolation from others and how we come to terms with that in life, as well as having purpose and meaning in life and where that comes from. These are really the big issues of existentialism and are the issues of existential psychology as well as its American form, humanism. I'd really recommend that if you're interested in the humanistic existential phenomenological approach, that a good place to start would be getting the basic writings of someone like Irvin Yalom, the basic writings of Rollo May, as well as the two individuals that we're going to study here today, Abraham Maslow and Carl Rogers. But there is a rich tradition that goes back to philosophy and existentialism, and this is really at the core of what humanism stands for. So let's take a look right now at what exactly it is that the humanists were conscious of. And that is basically the existence of free will. In science, and specifically in the social sciences, the pursuit of science is necessitated upon the idea of determinism. And the entire pursuit of science is one that looks for first hypotheses, then testing out hypotheses for a theory, and then leading to a law with the goal of the lawful prediction and control of phenomenon. And one can either be, as we see in contemporary academic psychology, a biological determinist, meaning that social phenomenon and personality phenomenon originate or can be reduced to biological causes, such as genes or brain chemicals. This is very popular today, and this is called biological determinism. And we have its the other form of determinism in social sciences today, and specifically in psychology, is environmental determinism. This would be the idea that parenting style, socioeconomic class, environment determine what or whom one becomes. And at first glance, or at just a cursory look, it seems as if these, environment versus biology are dichotomous and opposing, but in actuality, they're both deterministic views. Both hold the view that something is determining or causing the manifestation of who one is now, or their behavior, their feelings, and their thinking. This was the problem humanists had. Humanists had a problem with the idea of biological or environmental determinism. That for them, and of course the opposite philosophically of determinism, is free will, choice. And humanists based their philosophy and their psychological theory on free will, on the independent, autonomous ability to make and choose decisions in spite of one's biology and one's environment. Now, this is the real issue that scientific academic psychology has with humanism and with existential phenomenological psychology. Precisely that it is not deterministic. There are no lawful predictions that can be made. There are no cause and effect thinking here. This is a philosophy, a psychology based on free will, meaning that it's not studyable scientifically, at least through empiricism and positivistic sciences. Behaviorism was a very positivistic science, meaning that it completely relied on observable and measurable data. The humanists say that there are certain aspects of the human condition that are not measurable and not observable. And this is not too dissimilar from the psychoanalysts. So we really have in humanism not just a rejection of using human beings as subjects in scientific experiments, but the value of natural science in psychology itself. And there has been a recent trend, if you pick up some of the currently most popular introduction to psychology textbooks, including one of the most popular by David Myers, you'll find that humanism is no longer listed amongst the major schools of thought in academic psychology. Humanism certainly is a driving force in therapeutic psychology and psychotherapist training. However, as far as an academic psychology is concerned, humanism has really been shut out of the conversation at this point. And it's important to keep in mind why this is, and also to realize what we lose by rigidly rejecting what the humanists are trying to show to us. In my opinion, as we understand humanistic psychology, we're going to find that it certainly enriches our understanding of the benefits and limitations of the scientific method in social sciences. So let's look now at some of the foundations of humanistic psychology, beginning with Abraham Maslow. If academic psychologists rely on experimental methods and correlational methods to explore their ideas of psychological phenomenon, and if psychoanalysts primarily use data from practicing analysis and psychotherapy, what makes humanists different is that they gather their information mostly from observing things in the world. And although they can be interested in phenomenon such as psychopathology, mental illness, or sociopathology, it seems that their primary interest is in the individuals who really stand out in the human experience as the best specimens. In other words, individuals who are self-actualized in the terms of humanism. And self-actualization is a concept that was developed by Abraham Maslow and certainly has its roots in Nietzschean existentialism. As the concept of the Übermensch. We can even trace this back to Ralph Waldo Emerson's philosophies on the oversoul and self-reliance. But what we find in this idea of self-actualization, these are the people in our culture, and Maslow said it's really only about 1% of the entire population, 1 in 100 people that demonstrate the qualities of what is self-actualization. And this is an individual that has transcended, it's a transcendental philosophy, has transcended the basic pursuits and motivations of the human experience, and have enveloped a sense of mastery over oneself and a sense of fulfillment of one's own potential. And this is almost like the Buddhist or the Eastern state of nirvana. This is the individual who has achieved a state of not being motivated by extrinsic goals such as things as status and fame or material things. An individual that seems to be driven or motivated by something that transcends the basic human needs. And this is really what Abraham Maslow was interested in studying, as were many of the humanists, as well as how to achieve this state of self-actualization. So the humanists, I think we also see parallels with Buddhist psychology and Eastern philosophies. They're really interested in studying those individuals in a culture that have become self-actualized. Now, Maslow points out that there are very few of these self-actualized individuals. He pointed to certain people in history as being self-actualized, people such as Thomas Jefferson and Albert Einstein, as well as Harriet Tubman, individuals who demonstrated, Mahatma Gandhi, who demonstrated a transcending above the basic struggles of desire for fame and wealth and things of this nature, and really transcend it into a higher intellectual self-actualization. So this is who was studied by the humanist. Who is studied by the humanist? It's also what is and how it's studied, usually through biographies and autobiographies and through observation, even through understanding the individual's artistic or creative or intellectual output through what they write, through what they paint, through what they compose, etc. It's really looking at the cultural artifacts produced by individuals that are outstanding in the human condition. And this is really who the humanists were looking at. Now, their goal was to understand what these qualities were in these self-actualized individuals, and also to help others to achieve, to create a path towards self-actualization. And that's what we're going to look at now, the path towards self-actualization. In his theory, Abraham Maslow described 5 instinctoid basic needs in the human condition. By instinctoid, he meant inborn, that we were all born with these 5 needs. And these 5 needs, as it's commonly displayed on a pyramid or a hierarchy, start with the needs that are the strongest, the ones that are the most essential and have the strongest drive in us, and that would be physiological needs. Physiological needs are the basic human needs, basic animal needs, such as food and water and sex. Food and water to survive, and sex for survival of the species. Sex is not love in this. Sex is essentially the act of survival of the species. So that's the basic physiological need. Next, Abraham Maslow described a set of needs that were very strong in the human condition, however, were not the primary needs, and these were needs of safety and security and stability and order. This is predictability, and this is not essential for survival, but certainly makes living easier if one has a sense of control and stability over what is to come, a sense that they can handle what is about to come. It gives a sense of security. Now, for Maslow, these two needs are the strongest in the human experience, and they are also the needs that dominate the childhood experience. children who are mostly afraid of safety and order and security and stability, being fearful of being left at the supermarket by their parents or things of this nature. This is a sense of stability and security. Maslow said that in adolescence, in the teen years, up and through till middle age, we are primarily focused on two other needs. These needs are strong, but not as strong as basic physiological needs or the need for certainty and stability. These are needs for belongingness and love, and this, of course, differs from sex. Sex can be a part of love, but it's not necessarily part of a need for love and belongingness. This is a need to feel that one is a part of something bigger, that one is needed and has something to contribute to others, and that others will be there to contribute to the individual. So a sense of belongingness and love, as well as a sense of the need for self-esteem and for esteem within the group. So Maslow described these two needs as being predominantly focused on in adolescence up until middle age. And it's really one of having a sense of self-respect, a sense of being respected in the eyes of others, having esteem, and maybe even with a greater focus on some sort of fame or prosperity in some individuals, and a sense of belongingness and being loved. Finally, after middle age, Erickson said that there becomes a need that develops that's strong, called a need for self-actualization. And this is the need to fulfill all of the possibilities that exist within oneself in a latent form, all of one's potentials, living to one's fullest, self-actualization. And so this is certainly a strong drive in the human experience, but not nearly as strong as physiological needs. So from physiological and safety needs, these are the two most basic. These are the strongest in the human condition. Belongingness and love needs, and self-esteem and esteem within the group, prestige needs, these are also strong, but not as strong as the two preceding, the physiological and safety needs. And finally, a need to fulfill one's potential is a strong need, but not nearly as strong as the other four. Maslow points out that very few people, only 1% of the population, he claims, are actually achieving self-actualization. Most individuals are focused on either belongingness and love needs or esteem needs, self-esteem and prestige in a group. This can be achieved through titles and through wealth or having the presentation of material objects, owning things of that nature. But in an most industrialized or technologicalized or middle-class structured economics, families or individuals are usually focused on esteem needs and belongingness needs, certainly not on physiological or safety needs. In a culture that's developing, where there's severe poverty, physiological and safety needs will be the predominant need. It's kind of difficult to think about becoming self-actualized or having a sense of prestige when one's trying on a daily basis to survive for food and water. Maslow described some characteristics of the needs. Firstly, the lower the need on the hierarchy, the greater its strength. We've already discussed this. Physiological needs and safety needs are much stronger than needs for self-actualization. Secondarily, the higher needs, as we described, appear later in life. Maslow described the need for self-actualization to be occurring from middle age to the second half of life, and that the need for self-esteem and prestige and the need for belongingness and love was primarily from puberty through about the age of 40 and middle age. This is when these needs were focused on. And in childhood, the need for safety and stability, and of course the physiological needs of the youngest infant. He also described that the earliest needs, the needs for water, food, for safety and security, these were referred to as deficit needs. And this means that these needs were based on some sort of deficiency in the body. The deficiency needs are contrasted by what he referred to as growth needs or needs of being. And being needs or growth needs are the higher needs. These are not necessary for survival, but they're necessary for fulfillment of human potential. He also described that the higher needs are less necessary for survival, but they contribute to survival. Satisfaction of the higher needs is beneficial psychologically and emotionally. So human beings are not just physiological beings, they're also emotional beings, psychological beings, and that these needs, when experienced, can be experienced as strongly as the needs, the biological needs are. And a need does not have to be satisfied fully before another need is addressed. So an individual could be working on belongingness needs simultaneously with safety needs, or can be actually working for esteem needs and having simultaneously, difficulties with safety and security needs. So these needs can occur simultaneously, but there's usually one of emphasis, and there's also a characteristic unfolding of these that can be found amongst most individuals. Next, we're going to turn to looking specifically at self-actualization as well as the cognitive needs that we experience. Hi, this is the Dr. Joby Podcast. This week we're exploring the psychology of humanist Abraham Maslow. This is Lecture 6, Part 2, The Humanist Psychologists. Continue our conversation about self-actualization. There is an exam, a psychometric exam, a test that was developed to measure which of the hierarchical needs an individual fell on. And although this isn't a test that Maslow necessarily used, it was developed by Everett Shostrom, and it's referred to as the Personal Orientation Inventory, or the POI, and was developed in the 1960s and 70s. And I'm including a link to an online version of this exam. This online version is simply for entertainment purposes. I do not know how accurate it is. It's not the original POI, but it's similar to what one would find on a POI. And at least in my playing with the exam, it seemed rather accurate to my assessment. So you can look at this just as out of interest to see how you would rank on such a psychometric test. Now, remember, humanists really, it's not typically part of their research regimen to use something like a psychometric test. However, it's interesting to explore for the concepts of the hierarchy of needs. Now, looking specifically at the self-actualization need, Maslow said that the following conditions were necessary in order to satisfy self-actualization. In other words, to fulfill one's potential. The musician must make music, an artist must paint, the poet must write, and to ultimately be at peace, Maslow said in 1970. And what are the conditions necessary in order to satisfy this self-actualization need? And remember, we're talking, as Maslow pointed out, about 1% of the population. Well, Maslow said we must be free from the constraints imposed by society and ourselves, the shoulds, the tyranny of the shoulds, as one I talked about. Nietzsche spoke about the herd mentality. This is something Emerson talks about, and certainly something philosopher Martin Heidegger, existentialist philosopher, spoke about. Fallenness, the idea of being consumed by the mass and by culture and society. So one must be free from any of these social constraints and truly be living from one's own orientation. One must not be distracted by the lower needs. So in other words, all of the other needs have to be put to rest, come to terms with, before one can function in a self-actualized way. One must be secure in their image of themselves and with their relationship with other people. They must have an open heart, be able to love and be loved, have empathy and compassion. And they also must have a realistic understanding of their own strengths and weaknesses. They have to understand clearly their own virtues and vices. And Maslow said that if individuals accomplish these things, they could then approach self-actualization, living to one's fullest potential. Maslow also pointed out that one could be self-actualized and have to temporarily return to other needs in their life. So, in other words, when one achieves self-actualization, one could also then go back and have to deal with safety needs or with needs of esteem, etc. But it's a predominant mode of being in one's life that dominates, a need that dominates. This is exactly what the POI points out. What's the dominant need in one's life at that given moment? Abraham Maslow also described another set of needs, innate needs, and these have not been as popularized as the hierarchy of basic needs, but these needs are referred to as cognitive needs. And basically, what Maslow is proposing and pointing out that humans seem to have the basic need to explore, to think, to know, and to understand, to make sense out of things, purpose-driven, driven to understand meaningfulness and purposefulness. And this is really an essential aspect of existentialism. In existentialism, one of the ideas is that we have one of the things that we struggle with is a need for purposefulness, a need for meaning, and a need for understanding, of knowing. And different areas of existentialism determine whether or not we create that meaning for ourselves. And in Christian existentialism, one is called to a calling. One listens to a bigger something, maybe a calling from God or something like this, for a sense of purposefulness and meaningfulness. In secular existentialism, one is like a canvas. One's life is the canvas in which they create the work of art on. In this way, meaningfulness or purposefulness or the need to know, to understand, is one that is self-directed. One doesn't find themselves as an existentialist, one creates themselves. Well, this is a basic need, a cognitive need. The need to know, the need to understand. Maslow's description of the motivation of those who are self-actualized is not the typical motivation towards goals and the motivation towards things, accomplishments. It's more of a meta-motivation. And the meta-motivation is involving the maximization of personal potential. It's rather than a specific goal or object, it's something much broader. It's a much more holistic thing. And he referred to different meta-needs and meta-pathologies. And meta-needs were certain states of growth that he described self-actualizers work towards, and meta-pathologies were distinct, maybe even symptoms or characteristics that emerged when someone who was working in self-actualization failed to meet a certain meta-need. And I'd just like to describe a few of these meta-needs and the meta-pathologies that certain individuals who are within a state of self-actualization can encounter. The first would be truth. Individuals who are self-actualized seem to seek a sense of truth or a sense of understanding of what truth is. Individuals who fail to come to terms with this meta-need of truth can experience cynicism and skepticism, and not healthful skepticism or healthful cynicism. This is more of a thwarting, something that's holding one back in realizing their fullest potentiality. We can also look at goodness. This is a meta-need, the sense of an ethical goodness, and the opposite, the pathology that can occur if one does not achieve this sense of some sort of sense of this goodness, is hatred and repulsion, disgust, and reliance only on oneself for oneself. An individual, a meta-need of the self-actualized, is a concept of beauty, and the opposite, the meta-pathology of this, would be vulgarity and restlessness and bleakness. Someone in a state of self-actualization has a sense of unity and wholeness, a transcendence away from dichotomies, and even a sense of aliveness and a sense of spontaneity. The metapathologies could be a very rigid, simplistic view of life if one does not understand come to understand the issues of dichotomies, and also a certain stagnation, a certain deadness, or even a paralysis of oneself if they're not living in a spontaneous way. Self-actualized individuals often seek a sense of uniqueness and a sense of individual perfection, meaning not the demand of perfection in a mundane sense, but the fulfillment of one's potential as the perfect self. A sense of completion, of finality, of justice and order, of simplicity and richness, of being able to be playful and effortless in what they do, and also a sense of meaning and a sense of self-sufficiency. We see here some of the basic characteristics that the existential philosophers put forth in questioning what we must do in the human condition. And these are what Maslow referred to as the meta needs. Some of the characteristics of the self-actualized person. This is an individual who's efficient in their perception of reality. They are very aware of themselves and others, their biases, the biases of others, and how those biases can affect one's own motivations and worldview. This is an individual who accepts themselves, who accepts others, and accepts nature. They are less interested in feeling guilty or judging, and more interested in understanding. Their lives are marked by spontaneity and simplicity and naturalness and ease of living. These are individuals who seek to not complicate their lives with excessive things or with excessive preoccupations, but live in a very spontaneous, natural way, a free way, a sense of freedom. A self-actualized individual focuses on problems outside of themselves. They're interested in finding, exploring issues and finding useful solutions to social issues. They have a sense of detachment and a need for privacy. This is an individual who has, and a self-actualized individual has a strong need for time with themselves. They have a certain freshness of appreciation, being able to see familiar things as if for the first time, to approach things with a newness and a freshness. They are also very open to mystical or even peak experiences. This is a moment of intense ecstasy, a jouissance. It's similar to religious or mystical experience, and there's a sense of transcendence in this. And it's not necessarily religious or spiritual. It could be aesthetic or in love or in the joy of living. It's referred to as a peak experience. The individual who's self-actualized shows a great deal of social interest, not unlike Alfred Adler's idea of something more than just themselves, a sense of generativity, a social interest. They also have a profound interpersonal relationship. Not only are they effective at having a relationship with themselves, but also very close relationships with very select others. Self-actualized individuals typically has what's referred to as a democratic character structure. This is an individual that's able to think about and even try to understand people of other social interests and religious beliefs and political beliefs, and they don't show us any type of prejudice against these people. Instead, they have a strong desire to understand these individuals' points of view. It doesn't necessarily mean adopting their point of view or even agreeing with their point of view, but a willingness to hear and understand where one is coming from. They also have something that's distinct for self-actualized individuals is creativity, whether this be through music or writing or visual arts, dance. Creativeness is an essential part of the self-actualized individual. And also a resistance to enculturation. This is the idea we discussed earlier, that a self-actualized individual is able to understand themselves as a unique individual functioning within social setting or within a culture, and not an individual who's lost in that culture. As again, Heidegger referred to this as fallenness, the idea that one becomes part of the mass, part of the herd, and is defined more by their cultural affiliations, by on their own unique self. So the self-actualized individual is aware of their culture, aware of themselves, and can enjoy culture, can be part of society and part of a culture without being consumed or enveloped by it. Part of the human condition is doubting our own abilities and our own potential. And Maslow illustrated this very human condition that one must face towards their pursuit of self-actualization. The fear of success, we might call this, doubts in our own abilities. This is something he referred to as the Jonah Complex. And it's taken from the idea based in the biblical tale of Jonah, as called by God to prophecy, but Jonah was afraid to take the task, and he tried to run away from it, but no matter where Jonah ran, he could find no hiding place, and finally he understood that he had to accept his fate. And what Maslow's describing here is that we must not shy away from our own greatness, for fear of what that greatness, the responsibility that greatness entails, and that's a very existential idea. The existential crisis of responsibility. With self-actualization, with fulfilling one's own potential, comes a certain responsibility, and this is fearing away from self-actualization, sabotaging the self, not living up to one's potential is one of the hazards of being human, and Maslow referred to it as the Jonah Complex. And so we're simultaneously thrilled and excited about the potential accomplishment or transcendence, and also terrified of it because it brings a certain responsibility, a certain demand. We might even see this as individuals who get so close to finishing a degree or finishing a doctorate, or just so close to achieving some sort of mastery, and then stop just short of its fulfillment. It could be referred to as the fear of success or the doubt in one's own ability. But it's referred to in this philosophy as the Jonah Complex. So self-actualizers will constantly test themselves by abandoning the secure routines of success and familiar behaviors. So this is some way to get around the Jonah Complex, is to constantly be aware and to embrace failure, to fail again better, to say to oneself, I am going to pursue this, and I'm going to expect failure and become comfortable with failure. In this way, the Jonah Complex can be overcome. Accomplishment is a beautiful thing, but it's really more in the act of doing, of exploring, than in the achievement of. And so this is one way of coming to terms with Maslow's Jonah Complex. Some concluding remarks about Maslow's theory, and that is that in recent times, Maslow's hierarchy of needs has been presented in many different ways. It's been used in many different forms for motivation and for business success and things of this nature. I think it's important to realize Maslow's real intention for this. For Maslow, this was not a model for achieving wealth. This was not a model for achieving some sort of goal. This was a model for achieving fulfillment and wholeness in a very existential and human way. I think that we have to be careful when we see this model being used and maybe misrepresented in a way that's actually maybe even regressed or fixated in one of the more base needs. If one is presenting self-actualization, certainly in a sense like business school or some sort of effort like this, This is actually fixated in the need for acceptance, the need for prestige, rather than self-actualization. Self-actualization is the fulfilling of one's own personal potential, one's own personal well-being, and one's own personal set of possibilities. It's not restricted to having. And I think that this points towards something that Erich Fromm discussed, having versus being. Self-actualization is not a life based on what one has, what one possesses, whether that be objects or titles or wealth, but it's self-actualization is based on what one does, what one is, on their sense of being. And I think this is an important distinction that we should keep in mind when we're discussing Maslow's theory, and also when we're seeing Maslow's theory being presented from other popular disciplines of the day. Next, we'll be turning to the humanist theory of Carl Rogers and his idea of self-actualization. Thanks for listening. Hi, I'm Dr. Joby. Welcome to the podcast. This is Lecture 6, Part 3 on Humanist Psychology, Carl Rogers. Carl Rogers was an American clinical psychologist who was born near Chicago in 1902, and he died in 1987. He's known as the founder, the originator of self-actualization theory, and his overriding ideas about the personality strongly rooted in existentialism and in humanist psychology, and that is his belief in the actualization tendency. Rogers felt that there was one basic human drive, one basic human motivation, and that was a motivation towards self-actualization. And this is the ability to maintain, enhance, and fully realize the self. This is referred to in what Rogers called person-centered therapy as self-actualization. Rogers studied in New York City at Columbia University, at Union Theological Seminary, also clinical psychology at Teachers College of Columbia University, and he received his Ph.D. in 1931. He went on to work at a variety of mental health centers, ranging from child cruelty and prevention centers, and then went on to work in a variety of think tanks and centers which dealt primarily with national and international relationships as well as interpersonal relationships. Rogers did most of his PhD studies as well as his early research trying to identify the variables that led toward what he felt as either a healthy and constructive behavior or an unhealthy and destructive behavior in childhood. And he looked at things such as economic factors and intellectual development, family structure, cultural influences, social interactions, level of education. He looked at all of these things. And to his surprise, and actually failing what he had hypothesized, was that the single most important predictor of how a child becomes an adult, becomes a person, as either one that is well adapted and healthful or one that is unhealthful and maladaptive, is the level of personal insight, a level of self-awareness. He then proceeded to build his theory around this and his form of therapy into person-centered therapy, into helping an individual to increase the insight into themselves, their self-insight. And so this is really his idea of self-actualization, and he felt that within individuals there was an innate tendency, an actualization tendency, that this is the basic human motivation to actualize, maintain, and enhance the self. He put it this way: the experience helped me decide to focus my career on the development of a psychotherapy that would bring about greater awareness of self-understanding, self-direction, and personal responsibility rather than focusing on changes in the social environment. It led me to place greater emphasis on the study of the self and how it changes. Rogers felt that we actually come to see good and evil, good and bad, our code of morality and ethics through a certain valuing process that is in reaction to our actualization tendency. So the individual will come to evaluate all life experiences based on whether they serve to thwart or to enhance one's actualization, one's sense of self-actualization. And this is what he referred to as the organismic valuing process. So everything that happens to us in childhood, Rogers said, is seen and valued as it is understood to either enhance or inhibit our self-actualization. And this is why individuals can have similar experiences and interpret those experiences differently. And this is really what Rogers is putting his central faith upon, is the idea of the experiential world. This is what I referred to before as existential phenomenological psychology. Well, another word for phenomenon is experience. Phenomenological psychology has to do with, as Rogers referred to it, as experiential psychology. And this privileges the experience over anything else. So individuals are exposed to countless sources of stimulation, and some of them are important, some is trivial. And he wanted to understand how we come to react to these different stimuli that we come to experience. And what he said is that our reality of the world is something that's participatory. Now, this is taken directly from existentialists and phenomenologists. This is the idea that we participate in creating reality, in creating our world. And in this way, the experiential world, what one experiences, is privileged over the objective measurement of something, which means, in true spirit of humanist psychology, it's not a scientific, empirical endeavor. It's only empirical in the idea that we privilege our phenomenal experience over any type of objective measurement. This is similar in the phenomenological tradition to understanding approaching a film or a novel and never reading the same novel twice or never seeing the same film twice. This is the idea that we all approach something with not only our own unique worldview, but it's also a momentary worldview of now that changes. So Rogers pointed out that our experience of things, of films, of movies, of people, of life experiences, not only changes from one person to the next based on this experiential psychology, but also changes throughout our life history. So what we experience at 20 will be experienced differently. The same film or the same individuals will be experienced differently later in life at 30 and then later at 70. And we are participatory. We participate in meaning making of reality. Rogers said, "Experience is, for me, the highest authority. The touchstone of validity is my own experience." And here we see something very familiar and very similar to the theory of Carl Jung, who privileged one's experience over any type of objective knowledge. So for Rogers, for the humanists, the phenomenological experience is the reality for the individual. Carl Rogers described the development of the sense of self as a certain widening of the experiential field. At some point in childhood, and this probably has to do with the subject-object split of the mirror phase at some point in between the ages of 6 months and 18 months, when the child begins to recognize itself in a mirror, so becomes the object of its own subjectivity. And this is the birth of the I, the me, the myself, or the self-concept. It's it's an experience of the self as something distinct from the other. And in this development of the sense of self, the child begins to weigh itself against its society and its caregivers, and that's the parents. And for Rogers, what is essential here is positive regard. This is when the parent shows acceptance and love and approval to the child. And unconditional positive regard is when despite a child's behavior, there's an underlying acceptance and love for the child by the parents, an approval that's granted regardless of a person's behavior. And so this can be an example, not that a parent is obsequiously accepting of everything a child does, but rather the idea that even when the parent places limits with the child or scolds the child, that there's an underlying kindness and love that is present, that is unshaken, regardless of the child's behavior. This would be the idea that when the child chooses to do something that is against the parent's wishes, the parent's rules, or does something that's dangerous, that the child is not only reprimanded, but reprimanded with an unconditional sense of love. When love becomes the lever or the leverage for getting one to do something, or else you risk the loss of love, that's referred to as conditional positive regard. Conditional positive regard. And what occurs in these instances is a development of a sense of self that becomes miscarriaged. Now, miscarried autonomy sounds something like this. This is when an individual grows up with certain conditional positive regard, certain conditions for the parent's love. I will only love you if you think the way I think. I will only love you if you believe the things that I believe in. I will only love you if you act the way I want you to act. This is holding the child hostage for developing a sense of self that is not internal but is external sense of self. And that sense of self that is developing is always one that asks the question, what must I do for love? What must I be for acceptance in this situation? So the child develops a sense of self that's not internally based, but a sense of self that's always externally based, always wondering what one has to do to be accepted or loved by the person that they're being with. So we don't have a strong sense of individual self here. We have an externalized sense of self. Now, what we have occurring here is a situation that when one encounters adulthood, one does not know who they are. There's a miscarried or miscarriaged internal sense of self. And this is the adult who does not have a firm understanding of whom they are individually, but are always defining themselves by the things that they own, the people that they're with, what will get them acceptance from others. And this is what is at the essence of the sense of self. Rogers claimed that when an adult came to the therapy session, it might be the first time in their life that they experienced unconditional positive regard, the ability to explore and be whomever they are internally without the risk of rejection. Now, in the therapeutic setting, this does not mean necessarily that the therapist agrees with all aspects of who the person is, or even has to like what those things are. But in the therapeutic session, it's a safe place, perhaps for the first time in this individual's life, for them to express and explore their internal sense of self without the risk of negative reaction. So part of humanism, and this is why it's called person-directed or person-centered psychotherapy, is to allow the person to become whom they are on their own terms. And it's not the role of the therapist to serve as judge. It's the role of the therapist to show unconditional positive regard for this individual. positive, unconditional positive regard or positive regard, eventually shown from the parent and in later in life by the therapist during therapy, results in positive self-regard, and that's a condition under which we grant our own selves acceptance. So the idea is that under certain conditions of worth, these are the model that the externalized parent forms for the child's belief about themselves. When the parent is disapproving, the child must disapprove of themselves. So if the parent is showing a positive regard for the child begins to develop a sense of positive self-regard, a view of themselves. Who am I? Am I good? Am I bad? Am I worthwhile? Is a reflection of how the parent firstly judges the child in this way. So conditions of worth for Rogers is a belief that we are worthy of approval only when we express desirable behaviors and attitudes and refrain from expressing those that bring up disapproval from others. And this is what we need to change within the therapy session, from conditional positive regard to a state of unconditional positive regard. It means I may not agree with you, but I still respect and love you as a human being. Occasionally, when we're dealing with others, one will say something or describe something about ourselves that we find very offensive, and we become defensive about it, almost like we have to prove the person wrong, that they've gotten us wrong. Rogers referred to this as incongruence. Incongruence is when there is a discrepancy between the individual's self-concept, their view of themselves, and their experience. And for Rogers, this incongruence is a certain incompatibility, and what is strived for in self-actualization is the ability to see oneself as one is in their experience. So these incongruencies diminish as self-actualization is achieved. Now, the fully functioning self-actualized individual has a few characteristics, and this is what Rogers referred to as a fully functioning person. This is a self-actualized individual who is the characteristics that they possess. And these characteristics include being a fully functional person that's aware of all experiences, not just distorted or denied or chosen experiences, but all experiences that one has, good, bad, healthful, unhealthful, joyous, painful. All of them are taken, the fully functioning individual understands them as all having to do with something that is essentially part of who they are. That's awareness of all experiences. The fully functioning person lives fully and richly in every moment, not distracted by the past, memory we call that, or nostalgia, not always looking towards the future when something that, like in fantasy, but in the complete present moment, fully fresh and anew and spontaneous, and really aware of the given moment and appreciating that moment in its fullest context. Also, the fully functioning person trusts their own organism. In other words, they trust their own internal locus, their own sense, their own internal compass, their own internal sense of self. They aren't always looking to others to define whom they are. The fully functioning individual feels free to make choices without constraints or inhibitions. They bring a sense of power because they feel empowered in their decisions. They're not controlled by their past and by other people, and they don't feel compelled to placate the wishes of others excessively. They are fine with living from within their own compass, their own without constraints or inhibitions, living freely. The individual who is fully functioning, they're creative and they live constructively and adaptively, and they are flexible. This is the idea that the one who survives isn't the one who's strong. The one who survives is the one that's flexible, the one that's not rigid, that can adapt to given situations but still remain true to themselves. A fully functioning person can face difficulties, and be able to enjoy the difficulties as exciting and meaningful and as a way to learn about themselves, as an opportunity for living and for growth. So these are the characteristics of the self-actualized individual in Carl Rogers' point of view. Carl Rogers was a pioneer in researching using what he called encounter groups. And encounter groups is a method of research as well as therapy where individuals sit around together, sit around a circle together, and explore their issues individually and give one another unconditional positive regard. And much of Rogers' research was done through these encounter groups as well as individual psychotherapy. The thing we want to take from Carl Rogers' idea of the development of the self is the idea that the ultimate motivation of an individual is self-actualization, and that given an environment of love and support and compassion, that like a plant that gets sunlight and water and nutrient-rich soil, a person will thrive. With unconditional positive regard, the child thrives and becomes a blossoming individual that is defined from their own sense of self and not a miscarried sense of autonomy that is a result from having to become a person whom others want one to become for acceptance. And as in Rogers' experience, this often is the case of individuals who grow up in a household in which they come to reject the family's spiritual religious beliefs. And there's a price to pay for this for the individual, but this is exactly what Rogers went through, and it's exactly what is encountered quite often in therapy, is coming to terms with one's own personal beliefs, in this example, spiritual or religious beliefs, and being able to express those freely in the face of potential rejection from one's family members, certainly one's parents. So this is often one of the biggest things that one sees in therapy is an adult coming to terms with this type of miscarried autonomy.